Currently hard at work at my next project. Give you a little hint. I had to buy 3 gallons of something and I don't think I have enough. I hinted at this project back in May. Whoops. But better late than never, I suppose. So I had this idea for like an underwater installation, kind of like Soma, if you know that game. I wanted the focal point of the diorama to have this kind of like acrylic tube and a walkway walking through it, kind of implying a bigger sense of scale to that facility. So to start out, I just needed some rock faces, and I glued together some XPS foam. To make the rock faces, I just followed any steps that you would normally see in any 80s slasher films and just went to town with a box cutter or blade. Really just slicing and dicing. It's also nice if you've had a stressful day at work and just had some extra energy you wanted to get out. The only real downside to this technique is it creates an absolute mess. So you might want to have a vacuum on hand, otherwise you'll be pulling little pieces of foam out of the carpet for weeks. With the 80s B-movie horror show over, I then finished it off using just a aluminum ball to help soften up some of those edges. It's a pretty quick and easy little technique, but you do need to add a little bit of extra something to help seal it all. So for that, I use Blackmagic Craft's black paint and Mod Podge mixture. I just poured it out all over the piece and used my most abused and least favorite little brush. This should also help provide a little bit of extra strength along with sealing any of those little pores, especially because I glued 2 pieces of XPS foam together for this. And I really don't want resin to seep through these little cracks. Once it was dry, I went about painting the rocks. For the base color, I just used a graphite-y grayish kind of color. While the base color was still wet, I went about applying darker colors, just so I can get a little bit of variation in the rocks. With the other colors on, I went about using a wet, clean brush and just stippled and blended them all together. Really wanted those shadows to pop as well, so I got a black color and focused in on the recesses, cracks, and just naturally shadowy spots. With the darker colors done, I then went about adding some of those highlights back. For this, I just used a lighter gray and used the dry brushing method to just brush over all of the raised portions of the rocks. It needed one last final color, so I went with a greenish, mossy, algae kind of look and stippled it on using the same methods. Happy with how it turned out, I then glued it to the base. With having both sides done, I then went about sealing and preparing to glue in the acrylic tube. I felt it was going to be a little too simple to just have that acrylic tube, so I wanted to show a way for them to get into the facility. I ended up cutting out a little relief so I could put in an entrance. Not only will this add to the storytelling, but it will also remove some of the volume of resin that I will need to pour, which is a win-win. So I ended up just covering that XPS hallway with some styrene sheets and just little raised bits to just give it a little bit more texture. On top of the little styrene strips, I added some little bolt heads and used some thinned down Tamiya putty to give the styrene a little bit of texture to sell more of a rough steel look. With it primed, I then went about giving it a simple little rust paint job, just using a mixture between whole red and some yellow, and adding more and more yellow to help lighten it up and just give some a more varied look. And then to pick out all of those little recessed areas, I used some enamel track wash and focused it again along the seams for the styrene and all of those little bolts. To give it a little bit more color and to help blend it in with the rock face a little bit more, I used some green to help give it that algae look. Speaking of green, I wanted to add some kind of underwater vegetation, some kind of like a kelp look, And for this, I just picked up some aquarium plants, but these are far too vibrant for what I really want. So I just sprayed them with a quick coat of some olive drab. Again, not trying to get full coverage, but just kind of help tone it down a little bit. With the plant life sorted and the entryway glued in place, I then went about applying some of that ground texture. This is the same ground texture I've used forever, and I really wanted to add a nice little layer of this for, again, a little bit of added protection for when that resin inevitably gets hot. I don't want it to melt through that XPS foam, so I felt it was pretty crucial, more so than a simple little paste would have been. With it dry, I then went with a very vibrant yellowy sandy color. I know once the resin's on there, it's going to tone everything down, so I needed to accommodate that by punching it up a little bit. I was looking for a way to convey how these guys got here, and I found the perfect vessel. Micro vessel, mini vessel, underwater minivan. It's a SEAL team insertion vehicle. So I printed it out and gave it a quick and fast little paint job. And glued it in place. With the sub now in place, I needed to create a dam to hold all that resin in place. I ended up using a thin sheet of acrylic, and I'd seen some other videos of people using this kind of like sealing tape that it's meant for like window seals and stuff. And I've seen it used in epoxy resin pours and felt it was a good fit. The astute among you might see some of the issues with the way I put the tape, which we'll have to address coming up. But before we get to those issues, we need to tint the resin. Since we're going to be doing so many pours, I wanted to tint it all at one time. So I tinted the activator of the resin. That way the color would remain consistent between each pour. And now we've reached the reason why this video took so long to come out, because I was pretty terrified of pouring such a big resin pour. I ultimately decided to do it in several layers, and any layer lines that ended up being visible in the final product, I was just going to have to live with. But I was definitely way too afraid of pouring it all in one go and having it just absolutely melt down everything. And I'm not kidding when I say it took several days of just pouring and pouring and pouring. And here you can start seeing some of those issues with the tape. I had a little air pockets here and there, and you can kind of see the seam lines on top of the layer lines. Nothing that can't be fixed. I had done some quick kind of calculations to figure out how much resin I would need, and for the volume of the cube that it was making essentially. And I came a little bit short, so I ended up having to trim the sides down a little bit. After trimming the sides, I wanted to add a rough ripply texture to the top, so that way when light would shine through it, you kind of get this cool little wave effect as you're looking through the piece. So I used some AK's water, I think it's called transparent water gel, which, come to my surprise, was pretty much just straight PVA glue. It smelled almost identical. But then it was on to fixing the sides and removing those little bubbles and pockets and imperfections. And for this, we need a scene change, so I'm going to take you guys to my garage. Welcome to my garage. Fancy, I know. So for a quick rundown of what I'm doing here, I'm just actually using a orbital sander and using an aggressive sand cut of around 100 grit, and just trying to get all of the imperfections out, or as many as I can, without opening up more and more as I go. So I got to this point where I was happy, and once I got all of them out, I moved slowly up in grit count and eventually landed on, I think, 1500, maybe even 3000 grit sandpaper. And I'm just doing simple passes up, down, left, and right, 6 or 7 times with each grit, cleaning between each passes. And eventually, once I was up to that 3000 grit mark, I then moved on to using some automotive buffing compounds. For this, I just used some actual buffing compound plus polish. which ended up removing about 90% of all the little imperfections. There's a couple bubbles still here and there that I ended up not getting out completely just because I kept getting more and more as I went and started pulling some of the plant life out and felt I got most of the really harmful offenders, and most of this won't actually be seen once the compound and all of the dust is cleaned from the holes anyway. While the resin was curing, I also went back to build the little internal platform that was going to go inside the acrylic tube where our main protagonist can kind of hang out on. I just again threw together some simple little styrene profiles to just build this little bit of a gangway walkway bridge thing. Once the gangway was assembled, I just rocked the paint salt on there. I went with a simple little rusty metal-y look. And with the paint and rust effects all dry, I also wanted to add a little bit of lighting to highlight the main characters. Speaking of the main characters, I found these really cool Navy SEAL guys that had the respirators, or technically I think they're rebreathers, still on, and I thought they were kind of cool for this piece. So I printed a couple out and just gave them a quick little paint job. I saw this really cool like leopard camo-y kind of like weird, maybe even Arctic camo. But I felt it was a little bit better than just like a black, boring little wetsuit. And then glue them in place on the gangway. And tested out the lights just to make sure everything was working. Happy with the little test, I then loaded it into the tube. Here's where I kind of discovered the distortion was a little bit more than I was happy with, but from the main viewing angle, it's not too bad. But with the studio lighting on my desk, it's a little bit hard to see, especially with that reflection across. With that in place, I then gave the borders a coat of black paint, and this one was good. So yeah, after 5 months, I'm glad I finally got this project out. I was super excited about it for the whole time, but again, got a little nervous about doing that resin pour. And as you saw, there's some bubbles here and there, and there's some visible layer lines, which again, like I said at the beginning, I'm okay with. But that's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it this far, really do appreciate it. If you like what you saw and you want to see some more, click here. And if not, I'll catch you in the next one.